All right, it's a singing. Okay. This one. Oh, turn off the light. Now you're gonna go to sleep. This is my favorite part, just about. Although each of the pieces is really fun, but a synopsis of the chapter. Oh, I hope we can see how the chapter fits together as a logical argument to a telos, to an unstated telos, and that's the point. So let's see if we can pull out. As we look at each statement in the document, in the chapter. Remember, the statements were added, the chapters were added about 800 AD. The chapters were added about 1000 AD. The statements were added. We call them verses, but I call them statements. They were broken up, and so they may be kind of incorrect. But I've taken it and I've done a synopsis, an outline of 13. We already looked at each of the verses and translated them. Let's see if we can pull out of that translation the synopsis, the logos to telos, the logical argument to the telos. Now this does start correctly. In other words, where they broke the chapter is obviously a break it's an obvious break. As we'll see in 14, it's not as obvious a break. It's probably not a break between 13 and 14. We kind of looked at it a little bit. But in this one, this is the first part. It says, before the festival of the Passover. I'm going to mention this really quickly. I think I mentioned it before. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have them in the Passover, and John does not have them in the Passover. Part of the issue is that Jesus was obviously keeping the Essenes Passover. He was most likely an Essene. The Essenes kept the Passover according to the Torah. And if you remember when we studied the Torah, it says specifically when the Passover is supposed to occur. Well, what they had done very early is they had moved the Passover, especially after the Babylonian period. In the period of the Maccabean Empire, they had moved the Passover from the normal date to always be at Shabbat, to always be at the Sabbath. And the reason they did that was both commercial, and it made it easier for people to travel, because the Passover is one of the traveling festivals that was required by the Jewish people. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see them having a Passover meal. In John, it says specifically before the Passover. Now, they're having a Passover meal. Well, it doesn't say that, but it doesn't include the Lord's Supper either. So this could have been a meal, a grouping, a get-together before the Passover meal, which means it would be even earlier in the sequence than it seems to be set. Or it could be their Passover meal. The reason that they would do that is, remember I told you, John, we've proven, I think, very strongly, but John was written not to the Jewish people as much as it was written for the Romans and the Greeks. The Romans and the Greeks and late Christians, we're talking about 90 AD, their question was, what else? What else did Jesus do? They wanted to know the rest of the story, like Paul Harvey, right? And so they were looking for more. And so we see that more in this. And these are things, this is not included in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Not even, some of it's not even touched, although I didn't do any parallel stuff. I don't like to do parallel unless it's a direct parallel or unless it's an obvious, I don't consider it contradictory, but if there is something that appears to be a little at odds, but I'll mention this. This is probably, like I said, this is probably a pre-Passover meal. Jesus' time came And I've taken this, I know it's probably difficult to understand, I'll try to explain it, but I've pulled the verses out in the translation themselves and tried to synopsize them so they're, well, it makes it harder to understand, I guess. Jesus' time came to change place from out of that which he created to the Father. So literally in the Greek it says the time for Jesus to change his place from the cosmos to the Father. And what's really important about this is, if you remember, the cosmos is usually translated world, which is totally wrong. The cosmos is everything that was created. So this is saying that Jesus is literally going to the place that's outside of the creation. In other words, the place that is outside the created universe. In other words, to God, which means that he's God. It's over and over again we see in John especially. We see in the other Gospels too. But in John, most precisely, we see this very strong evidentiary method where John and Christ is actually making these claims that Jesus is God. And it's very obvious. I'm not going to go over all the stuff again. But anyway, it says, the next verse says, having loved like the gods his own. If you haven't been in this class, you know the question in Greek is when the translated word becomes love, you have to say, well, what kind of love? And in Greek, agape. Now we believe that agape just means like what a selfless love, whatever. But it doesn't. In Greek, in classical Greek and in Koine Greek, agape means literally the love that the gods have for man and not the love that humans have for God or for man. It's impossible for humans to agape. So when it says that Jesus, this is one of those words. When it says that Jesus loved like the gods his own, in other words, when it says Jesus agape his own, that's literally saying that Jesus is God to a Greek audience. Now we translate it love, but you love your cat, you love your pizza, you love your spouse, you love your kids. What kind of love are you talking about? The Greek guy would say, what do you mean? Huh? So it's very interesting because, and this is a transitional chapter. Chapter 13 is very powerfully transitional. This is the first time that Jesus talks about Jesus loving like the gods, and it's going to get even deeper. So it says the chief meal of he, the logos without a telos, that Judas should turn him over. Now, this is really important because in 13, at this meal, which by the way is a Passover meal in the other Gospels, at this meal, and this is specific to it, it says, at this chief meal, the logos without a telos. It's translated diablos. The diablos does not mean devil. It means literally a logical argument without a conclusion. And it's used to mean the most, look, we got to pretend like we're Greeks here, right? We need our Himatians and Pelops. We need to put on our robes. They didn't wear, what do the Romans wear? The Romans wore their togas. Greeks did not wear togas. They wore Himatian and Pelops. So we should have those on, and we should be thinking Greek. And when the Greeks are thinking, the worst thing in the world for them is a logos without a telos. And so therefore the most irrational being that could ever exist is the logos without a telos. It's diablos. You have a hyperbolos, a hyperbole. You have a parabolos, a parable. You have, what's the other one? There's a parabola is a near throat. these are all geometric terms and geometric ideas. So a parable, right? We know what parables are. You also know what a parabola is. The same word parabola is the same word parable in Greek. It means a parable. All right. You want to learn your math, right? You got to learn your math. Okay, a parable, a parabola. Right? Parabola? A hyperbola. In the Greek, a parabola crosses a single. The Greeks were a little bit different than us in the way they look at geometry. A parabola crosses only one axis in Greek. A hyperbole crosses all the axes in Greek. And a diablo has none. So that should get your brain to thinking, right? We're talking mathematics here when we're talking about Greek ideas like a parabola. Anyway, I'm not going to go any more detail really with that, but the big deal is, so we have this chief meal, and the setting is that Judas should turn him over. In other words, think about this. The setup of the logos, the logical argument, is being set for you by John. John is telling you at this meal that Jesus is, this meal is all about a couple of things. One of them is about this guy, this logos telos, that's Judas, going to surrender Jesus. And the other one is this. Watch what happens. It says, God gave everything into his hands, says Jesus. And away from of God, he came to the God and then withdraws. In other words, this is a statement that's made. I know I translated, I condensed it, so it's really hard to understand, but literally it says God gave everything into Jesus' hands. In other words, okay, what does that make Jesus? If God puts everything in your hands, you're God. Yeah, you're a God, you're God, period, God. And then it says, and away from the God he came. In other words, he came from God, and that he is going to withdraw to God. It's really interesting. It's not the word return. The word used is withdraw. So he's going to withdraw to God. So here's the setup. The setup of this is about the surrender to Judas. That Judas is going to surrender Christ over. And it's about how God gave everything in the hands of Jesus, and that he came from the God, and he is going to withdraw to the God. It's really interesting because it doesn't say from the God, it says a God. So directly addressing Jesus as God. So it says he stands up during the meal. Now, this is all together. It's all together now. So you can't separate this as an idea. It just didn't happen that this is now a new idea, but it all fits together. Jesus stands up during the meal, lays aside his outer garment, his emation, it says in the Greek. He girded a linen apron around his waist. He puts water into a basin for ablution of the hands and feet. And remember, we went through all I didn't redo all the bath words, but there is ablution, there is bathing, and there is cleansing. So you have, and the word baptismo is not in here at all. Baptismo is immersion. You immerse. Baptismo is always with a mikvah. A mikvah is the ceremonial bathing that the Jewish people did. That word in Greek is baptismo, which is immersion. This isn't any baptismo at all. This is the words meaning an ablution, that is ceremonial cleansing of the hands and feet, and full cleansing. We'll get to the full cleansing in a minute. But it says he put the water into the basin. So there was a basin of water. We think of the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees are the guys that are washing their hands all the time. Well, you didn't know, right? They're washing their hands and they're washing their feet. And it's not just the Pharisees. As a matter of fact, it could be the Pharisees, because remember, what did we conclude that Jesus' job was? Remember?
Rabbi.
He's rabbi of Capernaum. Yeah. If he's a rabbi of Capernaum, what group is he part of? He's a Pharisee. Oh, Saul was a Pharisee. Why couldn't Jesus be a Pharisee? Now, we know Jesus had some Essene tendencies, which is really cool, because he was bucking the trends. But we knew he was bucking the trends the whole time. He's God telling him what the truth is, right? And I find that pretty cool. Anyway, so it would not be unusual for Pharisees or for a leader of Pharisees, a rabbi, to have ablution for the hands and feet. And it's required ceremonially for what they're doing. Because they're going to a meal. And it would be required for the Passover, right? Even though this says before the Passover. Now, Simon Peter, he throws it in a bottle. He commenced to ceremonially cleanse the feet of the disciples. So he takes the basin that was required, the basin for the ablution, for the ceremonial cleansing of the hands and feet. And what does Jesus start to do? He starts to wash. He starts to not wash. He starts to ceremonially clean the feet of the disciples. This is a big deal. Who does this? Who's supposed to do this? Servant. A servant, or if it's a really high-ranking dude, if a really high-ranking dude comes to your house and you're the host, who's doing the ceremonial washing of the feet and the hands? You are. The host is, right? But usually, if you're inviting people to your house, unless you got somebody really on the scale above you, aristocratic or whatever, you tell it your servant boy, your servant girl, your slave, whatever, hey, do it. And they do it. Matter of fact, if you look at my book Centurion, we know that at the inns, the inns in all of the Galilee, all of Judea, and probably in the Greek and the Roman areas, if you went to an inn, you went to eat, they would ceremonially cleanse your hands and feet. So it was very, this is classical kind of stuff. But it says that Jesus is washing the feet of the disciples, which presents him as what? Number one, what is he? He is the host. And where does this put the disciples in the picture?
Yes.
Yeah, what kind of guests?
Honored guests.
Honored guests. Yeah, not just, look, I'm telling you, look, Jesus is the guy, right? It just told you that he's God. That's what it just said in the Greek. This guy is God. And then this guy who's God takes this thing, and he doesn't wash the hands. That'd be okay, right? Ish. He washes the feet. Very interesting. Hopefully they'd already washed their feet, right? Because they'd gone through the abolition thing. Who knows? Maybe they didn't, and Jesus was really worried about it. Now, I'm just kidding. But, this is a really important point. Watch how important this becomes. So, Simon Peter, he makes a logical argument. LA. Simon Peter makes a logical argument. I don't know what I do. He says, supreme in authority, Lord, you're going to ceremonially cleanse my feet? You see, okay, what are the other disciples? And the disciples crack me up all the time. They're just almost funny. They're I think, who said Simon Peter is the straight man, so he makes all the jokes and also all the smart stuff come out, right? Did you say that, Brad? I think you said that last time, right?
I don't remember.
Yeah. I thought that was a great analogy, that Simon Peter is the straight guy, Maybe he's just, either he just can't keep his mouth shut, or he's just not as bright as the other disciples. The other disciples are like, okay, what's this guy doing? Oh, but old Simon Peter says, are you gonna ceremonially cleanse my feet? He's like astounded, right? Because Jesus just said, I'm God. And so the God is now going to cleanse your feet. That's kind of interesting, right? Because you'd expect to do, Go to an Indian temple. Go to Aphrodite's temple. What do? You know what you do? You wash the feet of the god of the statue. That was very common to, as part of the worshiping that was done by the priests in Indian, in Greek, in Roman. So anyway, he says, you ceremonially cleanse my feet? Look what Jesus says. Jesus says, what I do, you do not stare at just now. You don't see right now. But you will know in company with these. What I do, you don't. Okay, it's talking to Peter. What I'm doing, you don't get it. You don't see it. Literally, it says in Greek, you don't stare at it. So you're not understanding it. You're not looking at it. You're not seeing this. But he says, you will know in company with these. In other words, with the disciples eventually. Peter makes a logical argument. LA. You shall you shall know not. Remember in Greek, it's, what is it Greek? Ume, know not. Not ever, not ever. You shall know not. Certainly cleanse my feet into the age. In other words, not into eternity. Not until the end of this age, you will not cleanse my feet. That's what Peter says. And Jesus says, look at this. If I do not ceremonially cleanse you, and you notice he didn't say feet. If I do not ceremonially cleanse you, you do not hold a share in with me. You do not hold a share. What's really cool, the word share, this is a word translated in lots of the other Gospels. We see it more often. The word share, in other words, in terms of inheritance. So the word, we think of things in terms of property ownership. The Greeks thought in terms of land or plots of land. That was what they owned, and those were the shares. That was what you got when you inherited something, was a share of the land. And it's the law in Greek literally means a share. So property rights were huge in the Greek culture. So if I don't cleanse you like this, then you don't hold a share with me. Everybody else, what are the other disciples doing? Right? Simon Peter, he's getting there, but he's going to be cool about this, right? He's going to be cool. He says, supreme in authority, not merely my feet, but my hands and my head. Okay, so Peter says, I'm going along with this. I want part of that, right? So do my hands and my head. Now watch what Jesus says. This is really cool stuff. Jesus said, he makes an LA, a logical argument. If you're cleansed in a Greek bath, holds no purpose if your feet are not ceremonially cleansed. Everything is purged, and not all of you are purged. This gets a little complicated, but remember I told you, a Greek bath, what do? You wash, it's actually pretty gross from our standpoint, but you put oil on yourself, and you take a Sturgis and you wipe the oil off, and you clean off your whatever. Hopefully it cleans out your pores, all the oil, because you use olive oil usually. And then you get in water, right? And they have warm baths and cold baths and regular baths. I mean, this is a cool Roman thing. And the Greeks did it too, but you're laying in a warm bath, and this is really good. But what are you? Cleaned all over, right? You're totally clean. You're purged, is what the Greeks would say. And actually, it's more than that. The word purge in Greek is catharsis. It means you're purged inside and out. Bang. So you've cleaned out your insides, People talk about purges now. It's the same kind of concept. I don't suggest cleaning that much inside and out, but that's the insinuation Jesus is making. If you've gone to the Greek bath, if you've been totally clean, and you use the word purge, you purge yourself. Yes, sir.
In medicine, we use the word cathartic. That's to clean out your mouth.
Yeah,
Purge you.
purge you. Yeah, I love the Aristotle writes about creativity as the purging yourself of ideas and putting it on paper. So vomiting out good ideas, that's probably a positive thing. Anyway, this is not necessarily about good things, but Jesus is saying, okay, so you're cleansed, if you're cleansed with the bath, that holds no purpose if you're also not ceremonially clean. Okay, we don't go through this, right? However, I will point this out. Anytime I go by a font, even Lutherans are trained to do this, right? When you go by a font, what do? You dip your fingers in, you make the sign of the cross. I wish our font was closer. We had some holy water. We get out of the habit, but the Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans, Lutherans, right? Okay, you're not going to find that in a Baptist church or a Methodist church generally, but it's.
Arlo does.
What's that?
Arlo, separate.
There are people in our congregation who will go up and do that.
Well, I'm not saying they don't. I'm just saying that we can, and we teach it, and it's a good thing, right?
It should be when you come in.
Right. I wish we had one, where when you come in.
We debated it, if I remember, building the church, whether to have it when you come in or the front. I don't know how they decided that it should be that.
So, but do you see the point here? Now, I'm not going to say that doing the sign of the cross with the holy water and the font is the exact same as the ceremonial cleansing of the feet. But we have turned it into that in a large manner, and that's cool if we're doing it right. Just saying. So we're going to get a little further. It says here. Let's see. If you're not purged, okay. Here's the point. Everything is purged, but not all of you are purged. Now, remember, part of this whole section or chapter idea, this section, is about the logos without a telos, that Judas is going to turn him over. So Jesus is making a direct relation to Judas, who is not purged, not cleansed. Now, I want to point this out. When it says the Greek bath, okay, it doesn't use the term baptismos like you'd expect it to use. But what do you think all the disciples and Jesus had done before they came to this supper before the Passover? What had they done?
They're supposed to prepare themselves and cleanse and get ready.
With what? What specific thing did they do? The mikvah. So they could do what?
Eat true.
Eat teruma, eat the Passover, right? Because now we don't know how far they've gotten in this, but you can't eat meat sacrificed to God, teruma, unless you have gone through the mikvah properly. So when Jesus is talking about the Greek bath, he is probably referring specifically to the mikvah. In other words, they've all gone through the mikvah. Now, does this mean that Judas had not gone through the mikvah? Does this mean that Judas's heart and soul, because he was a logos without a telos, had some issue? We don't know. We want to know. That's a question. It'd be a great question to ask. But we know that Jesus cleansed his feet ceremonially, right? Jesus cleansed all the disciples' feet. Yes.
Why do you think
Well, it makes a statement. It says, Jesus specifically says, if you're cleansed in the Greek bath, it holds no purpose if the feet are not also ceremonially cleansed. And we know Jesus is ceremonially cleansing their feet, right? But he goes on to say, if everything is purged, in other words, you've had the mikvah, you've had the Greek bath, you've washed your whole body, and you're ceremonially clean. But then it goes on to say, but not all of you are purged. That gives the implication that Judas was not prepared. And by the way, okay, I'll throw this out, but what is the ultimate teruma going to be?
The Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world.
The Lamb of God. They're not going to eat Jesus, but Jesus is going to be sacrificed for all the sins of mankind. He will become the sacrifice, right? So the Greek guys know this, the Jewish guys know this, all these guys know this, but this is, just think of this as being kind of a new, it's not a new idea, but remember, right at the beginning of John, what did John call Jesus? The Lamb of God, the Duran, the sacrificial gift of God. Very, very, very deep stuff. This is all, like I said, that we think of this as pieces, parts. They're not. They're all contiguous. So he goes on, he says, he's surrendering, not indeed the whole washing off, purging you are. Okay, this is right from the Greek, but Jesus saw that Judas, he's surrendering Jesus, not indeed the whole of purging. So, like I said, either he did not go through the mikvah or he was not prepared ceremonially. He was not prepared maybe emotionally. I don't know. But there's deep stuff in this. It is very deep into the writing. I bet he didn't go through the mikvah. I bet Judas had a real problem. We don't know enough about Judas, right? Anyway, but remember, the Greeks and the Romans want to know more about this, more about the whole thing. And he goes on, he says, he ceremonially cleansed the feet of them. You may know through personal experience what I have done to you. So, Peter relented, all the disciples relented. Apparently Judas his feet were ceremonially washed and clean. It goes even deeper. You speak to me, the instructor and Lord, and beautiful you make. The logical argument is, I am. Okay. Can this be any clearer? Jesus says, you speak to me, the instructor and Lord. Okay, should he be washing their feet? Should he be ceremonially cleansing their feet? No, they should be ceremonially cleansing his feet. He's the instructor. He's the Lord. But then he goes on and he makes a logical argument. He says, ego eimi. What did he just say?
God.
I'm God. I'm God. You can't miss this, okay? All the Greek guys going, and you remember what did the Hebrews do when they heard basically Yahweh? They fell on their faces, right? It's, this is totally absent, totally unrelated in our culture. We don't do this. I don't think there's any, unless somebody said, get down, they're shooting, right? Then you might get down on your face. But just common word usage like this, right? You don't care. But yet this is a key structure in the Greek telling us some wild stuff, some really, really powerful stuff. If I, the Lord and instructor, ceremonially cleanse your feet, and you are indebted to ceremonially cleanse the feet of one another. That's pretty straightforward, right? If I, the I am, the instructor, the Lord, if I cleanse your feet, then you got to cleanse everybody else's feet. Here it is, an exhibit for imitation or warning. We looked at this in the Greek. The word used means an exhibit for imitation or warning. Look, in Greek you can have just an imitation, you can have just a warning. This word in Greek, and I didn't write it down, I should have, means both imitation and warning. So how important is this? It's a threat. It's a threat. He says, just as I did this to you, you should do it to the others, to others. Jesus makes a logical argument. A slave is not greater than his Lord, neither someone sent than he having sent. And you are supremely blessed in case that if you do them, if you do this, if you wash others' feet. This is the only command that was given by Jesus that's a direct command to us, to wash each other's feet ceremonially. And it says if you don't have a share. That's John. Now you can skip it because it's not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? Now just skip it over. Not do that, right? When do we usually do foot washing in the church? Monday, Thursday. Which is supposed to be about this time, right? And in it, who's the ones that's supposed to be washing? Well, the leaders and the people that think they're high and mighty ought to be usins, right? Each other's feet. Ladies, don't wear your pantyhose or whatever. Don't wear your, guys, take off your socks. It'd be a real mess. But anyway, I just point this out to you because in the Greek, in the English, it's very strong, but in the Greek, it's even stronger than in the English. So, whatever. Maybe we should be doing this at home too, although, I will point out to you, we're mostly Anglo-Saxons, right? Anglo-Saxons, you got some Germanic in there, we got all kinds of everywhere, but, it's very classic for both Germanic and Anglo-Saxon cultures. What did they do when you came to the house? Especially after Christianity, but apparently they did it before Christianity too. Any idea? They would wash the feet of their guests. This is not worldwide, but it is very strong in many cultures that you wash the feet of your guests. And in a lot of Arabic, Middle Eastern, Slavic, Germanic, Anglo-Saxon cultures, you also give bread with salt on it. And so salt and bread, as a matter of fact, it's the classic trick. Okay, if you want your, I'm telling you the trick. This is a trick. They may have given it up now, but if you're in the Middle East especially, and you want your host to not put a knife in your back at some point and guarantee it, then you if they don't give you the host bread and salt, then insist on it. Because until you are given the host bread and salt, and this is true of Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Slavic cultures, you name it, but in Middle Eastern cultures today, once you've taken the bread and salt, and your host has taken the bread and salt, they cannot do anything against you under their house. Theoretically. I don't know how they're living today, but theoretically. Okay, that's the old, that's one of the things they really recommended that we did when we were, if you were captured, if you were working with whatever, because it assures peace, goodness, and they won't kill you, which is always a good thing. And he goes, let's see, he goes on and says, you're seeing right. Here we go. Jesus makes a logical argument. And remember, I told you, this is about the foot washing, the evolution, and bathing. There's a lot deep into this. But it's also about the logos without a telos, diablos, about Judas. So it says, Jesus makes a logical argument that the writing might be fulfilled, partaking of my loaf raised up against me his heel. In other words, one of those who are going to take up, who are going to eat from my loaf, is going to raise his heel against me. And where this is a really deep reminder, you guys remember back in the Old Testament? Although it's not exactly correctly translated, but remember what it said about the snake?
Strike his heel.
Yeah, you will strike his head, but he will strike your heel. And this is a direct relation back to that, specifically in the Old Testament. Jesus made a logical argument before cause to be that you should be convinced. Look at this. The reason that he's going to tell them about Judas to you before cause to be, what's going to be cause to be. Jesus is going to be given over by Judas. That this is all not implied. This is directly in it. Judas is, if you remember, we translated this, we looked at this. Judas is going to give him over to the Romans and to the Jewish leaders, and they are going to kill Jesus. And Jesus says, to you, before the cause to be, in other words, before this happens, that you should be convinced because ego eimi. He said you should be already convinced I am ego eimi because of what I'm doing, ceremonially cleansing your feet, right, in you. But he goes on to say, basically, if you don't believe that, if you don't trust that, this is going to happen to me. And he doesn't say Judas specifically, but we know who's the bad guy in this picture, right? He's going to turn me over, and I'm going to, die. He's already told them this before. They aren't listening very well. But so you know this, so you believe that I am. In other words, I'm God. I love that because every time he says it, that's what it means. So Jesus, he taking hold, I shall send. Me, he takes hold. Okay. I've synopsized this down so it's hard to understand, but Jesus makes a logical argument. He taking hold, I shall send. Me, who takes hold, that is he who takes hold of me, he taking hold of me, takes hold of he having sent me. Okay, let's see if we can get this. He taking hold, I shall send, because he takes hold of me. He taking hold of me takes hold of he having sent me. This is directly related to the ceremonial cleansing of the feet. In other words, if I'm going to cleanse your feet, what do I got to do? Can I do it without taking a hold of your foot? No, I got to grab your foot. I got to wash it, right? Maybe give it a pedicure, whatever. I got to take care of your foot. So if I take hold of you, it's saying you're part of it, and I'm sending you. In other words, to be sent out, you have to be ceremonially cleansed. He goes on to say, and the second part, he taking hold of me takes hold of him, the one who sent me. In other words, if you grab hold of me, who are you grabbing hold of? God. John tells us this over and over again. It's so obvious in the Greek, less obvious in the English, but if you're thinking about it, it becomes very obvious, right? If you're taking a hold of the one who sent Jesus, you're getting hold of God, which means Jesus is saying that I'm God. Over and over again, we get this. It goes on, Jesus agitated to the conscious breath. This is really important because the statement that gets made later, but the conscious breath is the hagios, is the, not hagios pneuma, it's a rook, it's the pneuma. The pneuma is the conscious breath, that's free will. So Jesus was agitated in his free will. Makes a logical argument. One of you will give me over. And the disciples are perplexed. Whom is he talking about? Remember, this is part of the whole point of this section about giving over. One disciple whom Jesus loved like the gods. Whoa, we think that's John the writer. He was with Jesus at this point. I cut out that part. But anyway, Simon Peter nods to him and makes a logical argument. Who of whom is he making a logical argument? Who is Jesus talking about? So this guy is right next to Jesus. That is the one he loves like the gods. We presume this is John. And Simon Peter, wink, wink, nod, nod, goes over and whispers, right? And how Jesus can't hear, I have no idea. Jesus, of course, can hear, It's old Simon Peter. And so he says, who is he talking about? Who is this guy? And the one against the bosom of Jesus, the one that Jesus loved, right? Like the gods. Lord, a certain one it is. He's asking a question. Remember, the Greek is funny this way. This is very classical. A lot of ancient cultures, they do this. They don't ask straight out, except Simon Peter does, and that's part of his issue. Jesus, he is to whom I will immerse the morsel, and he gives it to Judas. So remember, he says, whoever takes part of my loaf, Jesus takes part of the loaf, breaks it, dips it in, and I told you, we don't know what he dipped it in. He could have dipped it in gravy, a good Southern guy, right? But he may have dipped it in wine. He may have dipped it in the cup. We will tincture is, where you take the bread and you dip it in the wine. Orthodox do that, Anglicans will do that. Catholics less common. The Orthodox Church actually tinctures everything. So they take the bread and dip it in the wine and give it to you as like kind of a sloppy thing to your mouth in a little spoon. That's why there's a spoon, by the way, in ours. You can tincture it for people who need it done that way. Anyway, he gives it to Judas, the morsel, and at that point it says Satan came into him. This is specific, not Diablos, but Satan. So before the Satan, Judas is already the logos without a telos, which I think is really coolio in Greek. He was, in other words, what the author is telling us. This is a question people have all the time. Okay, so if Judas is there and all of a sudden, he takes the morsel and then Satan comes into him. So was it his fault? Could he stop it? Could he prevent it? The point is this. The writer tells us that not that he was the devil, not that he was Satan, but rather that he was the logos without a telos. In other words, he knew the logical argument, but what did he not know? He was not convinced. He was not convinced. He goes on to tell us that even though all these guys were supposed to be purged, they were supposed to be ready to eat teruma for the Passover, for some reason he was not. I would argue that he had not had the mikveh, had not been through the process. Jesus washed his feet. He gave a ceremonial ablution, but it's telling us that it's not sufficient. Now, as Lutherans, we'd say, yeah, we go with that because if you're not baptized, right? We'd say if you're not baptized, it's not good. So likewise, if you don't have the mikvah, you can't eat teruma, okay? We say if you're baptized, you can eat the sacrifice of thanksgiving, which is the Eucharist. Whoa! Coolio. See how this all kind of fits? It's really, actually it fits 100%. It's really fun stuff. Anyway, but it was Satan came into him, but it wasn't that he was not already influenced. For some reason, old Judas was just not there. And if you remember before this, in the previous chapter, what was old Judas doing with the money?
Skimming off the top.
He was skimming off the top. Skimming off the top. We get a reference to this. Look, this John, all the gospel writers are really smart dudes. But John is super smart. And watch what happens here. This is really neat. The disciples, not even one knew why he spoke to him. He spoke to Judas. They had no idea. Remember, he told them, whoever takes a bite of this is the one who's going to turn me over. For some reason, they thought that Judas was the top guy. He was the best guy of all the disciples, the most trustworthy, the bestest, the goodest, and he's skimming off the top. Anyway, it says they did not know why Jesus spoke to him, even though Jesus had just told them. This goes both to culture and to the fact that the disciples were totally fooled by this guy. That's really interesting to me. Judas held the money. This is a logical reference back to the previous chapter where it said he was skimming off the money. Remember, from that whole section. He held the money. Some suppose that Jesus lodged garment to make purchase for the festival, or that he should get them to the bent over, to the prosperous, to those who were the super poor, those who could not, the ones who were basically crippled in the street, who could not work for a living, could not provide their own. That's what they thought. And it says that he went directly, that is Judas, and it says he was a knight, and we kind of went through that. Now, they're by themselves without Judas, and it says Jesus made a logical argument. Now, the offspring of the man face ascribed value. And I cut this other because it's not as important. God ascribed value. It says, now the offspring of man has been ascribed value. How is he going to be ascribed value? As a sacrifice for mankind. And it goes on, it says, God has ascribed value. In yours, I've got it a little shorter. It says, if God ascribed value into him, and God will ascribe value to him into himself, and directly he will ascribe him value, because he is God. I've added the other part. This is all a logical argument in the Greek. It's a logos to tell us. John actually tells us to tell us. To tell us is this thing. So Jesus makes a logical argument. Now the offspring of the man face is ascribed value, and the God ascribed value. If God ascribed value into Jesus, and God will ascribe value into himself, he will ascribe him value. This is another way of saying directly that Jesus is God. And the reason this is important is because, from a Roman standpoint, or from maybe from a standpoint of a person who doesn't really get what Jesus did, the fact that Jesus is dead is he's dead, right? What kind of value is that? Well, we're going to see it later, because in the resurrection, we see that he proved beyond a shadow of doubt that he's God. But that's the point. What is the value of Christ? It's not necessarily purely in death, but rather in the fact he proves he's God, right? Through being resurrected. That's the power in this. And, to us, this is just, you can say this is build-up. This is a logical argument that's being provided in Greek by a Greek guy, John, who happens to be a Hebrew guy too, basically, like I said, to Greek and Roman thinkers, Greek and Roman audience. And when they hear this, they're like, okay, we're getting it, we're ready, right? Of course, what do? We go, what is he talking about? He's giving all this logical stuff. It's like, this, anybody took the stupid GRE test and all those tests, and they had the whole logic section, and you have to figure out who was married to who, or, who stole the money from, you know what I'm talking about? No, you're not shaking your head, so maybe you didn't. You ever have to take that stupid test You have to sit there forever trying to figure out the logical reasoning answers to these stupid questions. That's the Greek. That's what it is. This is all logic and all that stuff that, comes out of geometry and trigonometry that we've all forgotten a long time ago. Anyway, and Jesus makes this comment, even now I am, ego eimi, not a statement that will be made directly, short with you. And I told you it's short in time, short in all kinds of things. You will seek to worship me, as I said to the Judeans. Where I lead, you can't go. Because it's not that he's just going to death. I mean, you can follow him if you go to death, right? It isn't death he's going to. He is literally going outside the cosmos. He is literally going to the God, what the Greeks call the plenum of God. It is God, right? So he is going beyond anything that any human can go or any being can go except for God. I make a logical argument. I give you a new innovation, a vanishing point a vanishing point. This is a conclusion. This is a logos to a telos. And Judas missed the point, right? The logos without a telos missed the telos. Jesus said, and this is literally in the Greek, I am giving you a new innovation, a telos. And the telos is this, that you should love like the gods one another, just as I have loved like the gods you, and that you should love like the gods one another. Goes on, you will know you are my disciples because you hold the love of the gods into one another. And then Simon Peter makes a statement, Simon the Rock. Logic argument. Lord, at what locality do you lead under? Bum. Look, Peter, haven't you been listening? This is cultural, it's also whatever. I just don't think, I love Simon Peter, but I just don't think he was very bright. The other disciples are getting, maybe, hopefully they're getting bits, but luckily he's the kid in the class who asks the question, right, when he doesn't know, which is probably a good thing, because then we get the freebie. Remember, I'm going to hold it for you forever. He's a straight man who lets Jesus answer the question, right? And really, that's pure Greek stuff. So Peter said, "You will be the same way with me eventually. Where I lead under, you are not able now to be in the same way with me." You notice the same way. That's what they call themselves. We talked about that. You'll be in the same way with me eventually. In other words, you're not going the same way now. Peter makes a logical argument. Lord, through what am I not able now to be in the same way with you? In behalf of you, I will place my mind. We translate this as, I will die. It doesn't say that at all. He says, I will obey and listen to you, basically. Your suke. I will put down my suke for you. Okay, cool. So you're gonna listen to me now, right? Jesus is going, are you gonna listen to me now? I wish they would add the extra part, right? Jesus, I will point. Jesus, your mind in path you will place. He makes a logical argument. No. Umi. No. A cock will admit until you deny me 3 times. And I told you, this is not the end of the story, because 14 is a continuation of 13, and they broke it in the wrong part. I guess you'd say that. They broke it in easy parts that you could read, I guess, but they should not have broken it here. This is not the logical part to break these 2 sections. But next week we'll get into 14. We'll start a little bit. I'll go back and we'll go to 14 and set that up, because that obviously, now that Judas is gone, we're going to get the rest of the story, right? the rest of the logos and the telos. But the thing I want to note for you, remember this. How can you agape? How can you love like the gods?
You have to be first be made a God.
You got to be made a God, which Jesus said you are made a God through belief, or the best word in the Greek is by pisteo. By being convinced of Jesus, you are inheritors. If you're an inheritor of Jesus, that means you are a son or daughter. You're an offspring of God. If you're an offspring of God, you're a God. If you are a God, then can you agape? This is cool stuff, right? That's why they call themselves hagios. Hagios is a demigod in Greek, and they call themselves hagios. So the Greek is so powerful, much more powerful than the translation we get in English, although it's supposed to be the same words, right? But we see that as we dig into this and take it apart, that we can see all the connecting lines and pieces in this. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray.